In the wake of what was meant to be a humiliating defeat yesterday by, was it 112 votes to 111, 90% of Parliament, echoing the 90% of submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill, voted overwhelmingly and resoundingly to defeat the Treaty Principles Bill and to send the ACT Party leader and his party, MPs, there were acts of what I could only consider yesterday provocation directed at the ACT Party from those who think that they have won. And there is the issue. Listen, yesterday observing Parliament on this particular vote and the speeches that were made, I was reminded of a phrase that has become immortal, in actual fact, in the history of Western democracy and particularly of British history. And it was when Oliver Cromwell, and how ironic that I live in Cromwell, and after whom, you know, it's named, or he's named, the town is named after Oliver. His message, in fact, almost exactly to this day, on the 20th of April, 1653, to the Long Parliament, when he strayed into the Long Parliament with a military force at his back and said, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." And I would have almost hoped that the ghost of Oliver Cromwell would have wandered into Parliament at about mid-afternoon yesterday and said to the same New Zealand Parliament pretty much the same words. "You've sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go." Because what Parliament did yesterday was not, in actual fact, declare any particular issue. They didn't clear their throat. They didn't reject anything. They just decided to continue to plunge New Zealand into the morass of misunderstanding and of misapprehension. That is the Treaty of Waitangi and its interpretation. This issue won't go away. In fact, this issue is, thanks to David Seymour and the ACT Party, but as current as it was before they even introduced the bill. The principles of the Treaty of Waitangi remain undefined since they were inserted into legislation, I think 1985-86, by Geoffrey Palmer, who, as I recall in conversation with now deceased Labour Prime Minister Mike Moore, said to that cabinet, as he inserted the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi into the state-owned enterprise legislation, he said to them and various other pieces of legislation at the time, when asked specifically by Mike Moore, what do the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi mean? The reply of Geoffrey Palmer, and this is why he's such a tosser, quite frankly, intellectually, I don't care what he does physically, and that is that he said, well, they don't really mean anything. They're just there, a bit of window dressing. Well, we all know that within a couple of years, the Court of Appeal had decided that the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi were not window dressing, that when they were in legislation, they were serious stuff, and that they needed interpretation. And so, independent of Parliament and of politicians, the elected representatives of all, the Court of Appeal decided what those principles of the Treaty of Waitangi should be. Now, can I tell you, in determining those, and at the time there was a fair bit of criticism of the activism of Lord Cook of Thorndon and his peers for deciding what that was, but at the end of the day, well, if Parliament's not going to do its job and you put it into legislation, understandably people, and that's the case of the New Zealand Maori Council, will go to court and say, well, we don't think that the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are being adhered to in the actions of the Crown. Understandably, because again, Parliament didn't do its job properly and the government had failed the country, the Court of Appeal stepped in and said, well, that's what this means. Now, since that judgment by the Court of Appeal, and what's that, almost 50 years ago now, it's extraordinary really, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi have been reinterpreted on an almost monthly, daily, weekly basis, mostly by public servants and by the Waitangi Tribunal, but also by academics and activists, to the point that here I stand on the 11th of April, or sit actually on the 11th of April, 2025, and no one really is any better understood of what the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are than they were when they were first inserted into those legislative agenda of almost 50 years ago. And the extraordinary thing about this is that the interpretation has been left to the courts, to public servants, to the government departments, to the Waitangi Tribunal, to academics and activists, but at no stage has it been interpreted by Parliament, whose legislation it was and continues to be, and whose responsibility it is to tell us, if you are going to put it into legislation as an overriding principle, what the hell it practically has effect to do. I mean, that's its job, Parliament. And yesterday, all I could see was 112 or 113 parliamentarians absolve and abandon themselves from that responsibility of telling us. So here I am this morning, Friday morning, here we are, no better aware. And the worst part is that because there is this vacuum of leadership from Parliament in Wellington, it then is left to a whole series of unelected people to have dominion over us. And I'm not talking about the judges or the legal profession in this particular case. I'm talking about public servants and government departments, even to the point to this day that Pharmac, well, whom our next guest is impartially responsible, still have invented a fourth principle of the Treaty of Waitangi and included it in their front pages of their social media. It's extraordinary. And local government, government departments, the police, those in land revenue, those who have dominion over you, are all got slightly different interpretations of what the principles are, number one, but all of them come down to the same argument, that there are two types of New Zealanders in this country, and we will never be one, despite the best efforts of Governor Hobson in 1840 and the rhetoric that might have flourished on the Waitangi lawn. We are not one people. In fact, the principles and the way that they are being interpreted now, and the powers and responsibilities that are gifted to particular individuals or particular ethnicities over others, mean that we can never be one people. And that far from the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi uniting us, they divide us, and they will continue to divide us still. Parliament walked away from its responsibility yesterday. It was supine before the faces of activists, before the judgments of academics, before the poobah overlordship of the courts and of the Waitangi Tribunal. It had a chance yesterday to sort this out once and for all, but it didn't. It didn't take that opportunity. It walked away. It surrendered. It is covered in infamy, I have to say, on this morning, because the principles are still alive, still shifting, still changing their shape, their colour, their particular interpretation, their influence upon New Zealand and New Zealanders, and they'll continue to do so, completely independent from those who we elected to resolve and to actually regulate what the treaty means and what influence it has in our lives. So, you know, for those who proclaim that there was some sort of victory yesterday, yeah, there was a victory of surrender. There was a victory of indecision. There was a victory of those surrendering, I have to say, to a whole great group of bureaucrats and government departments, the future determination of what the treaty means in our lives. It was certainly not a victory for anything other. Those are my thoughts this morning. What are yours?